The rain didn't just fall in the subdivision of Crestwood, it hammered against the pavement like a rhythmic warning. Officer Elias Thorne sat in the driver's seat of his cruiser, the blue and red lights reflecting off the drowning windshield in rhythmic pulses of violet. Beside him, in the specialized canine enclosure, Rex, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt mahogany in midnight, sat perfectly still. His ears were perked, his dark eyes scanning the blurred world outside. "Steady, boy," Elias murmured, more to himself than the dog. Elias had been a handler for 9 years. He had seen the worst of humanity in the dark corners of the city, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet asphalt. The call had come in 20 minutes ago, a foot pursuit. A suspect had vanished into thin air near a quiet 2-story home while the owners were out of town. As Elias stepped out of the cruiser, the humidity clung to his uniform. He led Rex on a short, tight lead toward the perimeter. 2 patrol officers, Miller and Higgins, stood by the open side gate, their flashlights cutting through the downpour like lightsabers. "Status?" Elias asked, his voice low and professional. "He ran through the backyards," Miller explained, wiping rain from his brow. "We found the side gate open and the back door unlocked. Neighbors reported hearing a struggle, thuds, maybe a muffled shout. We swept the first floor, but something feels off, Elias. It's too quiet. We haven't cleared the upstairs yet." Elias looked at the house. It was a standard suburban build, brick siding, white trim, a small porch. It looked like a place where people lived happy, mundane lives. But tonight it looked like a tomb. "Rex, search," Elias commanded. The transition in the dog was instantaneous. Rex's body lowered, his nose hit the floor, and his muscles bunched with purpose. They entered through the rear mudroom. The house smelled of lavender laundry detergent and stale air. On the first floor, everything was pristine. The living room had plush beige carpets and family photos on the mantel. The kitchen featured a clean marble island. Rex moved like a phantom, his paws silent on the hardwood. Room by room, the clear signal was the same. No suspect, no blood, no sign of the struggle the neighbors had described. "Let's head up," Elias whispered into his shoulder mic. The air grew warmer as they ascended the narrow wooden staircase. The second floor consisted of a long, cramped hallway, 3 bedrooms and a shared bathroom. Rex led the way. He was a tank of a dog, a creature of pure instinct and training. Yet Elias noticed a slight hitch in his gait. The dog wasn't pulling toward a scent. He was cautious. They entered the first bedroom, a guest room with floral quilt. Clear. The second bedroom, a home office with a silent computer monitor. Clear. Then they reached the bathroom at the end of the hall. Elias stepped into the bathroom, scanning behind the shower curtain and under the vanity. It was empty. He turned to leave, but Rex didn't follow. The dog had frozen in the doorway. His hackles, the hair along his spine, stood up like needles. A low, guttural growl began in the back of his throat, a sound Elias had only heard when Rex was facing a genuine, lethal threat. But Rex wasn't looking into the bathroom. He was staring out into the dark hallway they had just walked through. "Rex, what is it?" Elias whispered, his hand hovering over his sidearm. The growl escalated into a frantic, aggressive bark. Rex was snapping at the air, his eyes locked on the far end of the hall, near the door of the last bedroom. "I have the suspect in the end bedroom," Elias barked into his radio, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But as Elias moved forward, gun drawn, he realized he was alone. Rex had planted his feet, his claws digging into the carpet, refusing to follow his partner into the dark.
The silence that followed the fugure's disappearance was louder than the rain. Elias felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. He looked down at Rex. The dog's eyes were wide, showing the whites, a sign of pure, unadulterated distress. This was a canine trained to ignore the chaos of flashbangs and the crack of gunfire, yet he was trembling. "Rex, "Heel," Elias commanded, his voice cracking slightly. Rex obeyed, but it was mechanical. He moved with Elias, but his head was turned back toward the stairs, his tail tucked tight. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was surviving. Elias reached the door of the third bedroom. The wood was cold to the touch. He took a deep breath, centered his sights, and kicked the door the rest of the way open. "Police! Hands in the air!" He swept the room with his weapon and light. Left corner, right corner, the bed. Nothing. The room was small, perhaps 12 by 12. A simple wooden bed frame with a white mattress sat against the far wall. A dark oak dresser stood opposite it. No one was standing by the window. No one was behind the door. Elias's pulse thudded his ears. "I saw you," he whispered to the empty air. "I saw you walk in here." He moved to the bed, dropping to one knee to check the underside. Just dust and a stray sock. He checked the closet. It was a shallow reach-in with a few empty hangers that swayed slightly from the draft of the door opening. There was no attic hatch, no crawl space. The window was locked from the inside, the glass unbroken, the screen still seated in its frame. The heavy thud of boots sounded on the stairs. Miller and Higgins burst into the hallway, weapons drawn, faces flushed from the climb. "Where is he?" Miller panted, scanning the hall. "He went in there," Elias said, pointing into the bedroom. His hand was shaking, just a fraction, but enough for him to notice. A tall figure, dark, he walked right in. Higgins entered the room, checking the closet again, then the dresser. He pulled the drawers out, one by one, empty. "Elias, there's nobody here. There isn't even a place to hide. Did he go out the window?" "Locked," Elias replied, curtly. "Check it yourself." Higgins tugged on the window lock. It didn't budge. Maybe a secret panel? They spent the next 10 minutes tapping on the walls, feeling for hollow spots in the drywall and checking the floorboards. Rex stood in the hallway, exactly 3 inches outside the bedroom's threshold. He would not step a single paw inside. When Miller tried to coax him in with a firm tug on his harness, Rex let out a sharp, pained yelp and bared his teeth, not in aggression, but in terror. "Look at the dog," Miller whispered, stepping back. "He knows something we don't." "The basement," Elias said suddenly. "The neighbor said they heard a struggle. If he's not up here and we cleared the first floor, he's below us." They left the upstairs. As they descended, Rex's demeanor shifted instantly. The trembling stopped, replaced by a hyper-vigilant stiffness. He was still spooked, but he was back in the fight. They reached the kitchen. Elias noticed the door near the refrigerator, the one he had glanced at earlier. It was a simple white door, identical to the pantry. He reached out and twisted the knob. It was unlocked. As the door swung open, a smell drifted up from the depths. It wasn't the smell of a normal basement. It didn't smell like damp concrete or old boxes. It smelled like copper. It smelled like old dried blood and something sickly sweet, like rotting lilies. "Dispatch, Thorne," Elias spoke into his radio. "We've located a basement access. Proceeding down. Be advised, we have an unidentified odor. Expedite additional units to our perimeter." "Copy, Thorne. Backup is 2 minutes." Elias clicked on his heavy-duty maglite. The beam cut into the basement like a scalpel. The stairs were wooden, narrow and steep. Each step Elias took sent a groan through the house, a sound that seemed to echo and multiply in the darkness below. Halfway down, Elias stopped. He shined his light toward the center of the room. There, sitting perfectly centered under a single burnt-out light bulb, was a metal folding chair. It was bolted to the concrete floor. Yellow zip ties hung from the armrests, severed cleanly as if by a razor. Below the chair, a dark, viscous pool spread across the floor. It wasn't too thick to be water. In the harsh LED light, it shone a deep, bruised crimson. "We have a crime scene," Elias spoke into his radio. "We've located a crime scene, 1040. Then, from the far corner of the basement, behind a wall of stacked water-damaged crates, came a sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound of a fingernail dragging across wood. Rex didn't bark this time. He went low to the ground, a low vibration humming in his chest. He looked at the crates, then slowly looked up toward the ceiling, directly toward the floorboards of the bedroom they had just left. "He's still here," Elias whispered, raising his gun. "He never left the house."
The basement was a cathedral of shadows. The air was so thick with the metallic tang of blood that Elias could taste it on his tongue. He kept his weapon trained on the stack of crates in the corner, his tactical light trembling ever so slightly. "Police! Show me your hands! Do it now!" Elias's voice was a jagged edge in the dark. The scraping stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic patter of rain against the small, high basement windows and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Rex. The dog was a statue of tension, his nose twitching, his eyes fixed on a narrow gap between the boxes and the foundation wall. Behind the crates, there was a door. It wasn't a standard door. It was a heavy, industrial-looking slab of wood reinforced with steel straps. It looked like it belonged in a bunker, not a suburban home. There was no handle on the inside, only a heavy sliding bolt on the exterior. "Miller, cover the flank," Elias ordered. Elias reached for the bolt. The metal was ice cold. As he slid it back, the screech of metal on metal felt like a scream. He kicked the door open and stepped back, centering his sights on the opening. "Don't shoot! Please, don't shoot!" The voice didn't come from a monster or a ghost. It came from a man. He was huddled in the corner of a room no larger than a closet. He looked to be in his mid-40s, his clothes tattered and stained with the grime of long-term confinement. His beard was overgrown, and his skin was a sickly, translucent pale from a lack of sunlight. He flinched violently at the touch of Elias's flashlight beam, shielding his eyes with hands that were raw and blistered. "Are you alone? Is there anyone else?" Elias asked, moving in to shield the man while scanning the tiny cell. "He's gone. He ran when he heard the sirens," the man whimpered. His voice was cracked, barely a whisper. "He left his phone. I called. I finally called." As Miller began to help the victim up the stairs, Elias looked at the floor of the cell. There, lying in the dust, was a modern smartphone. The screen was still cracked, showing the outgoing call log, 911, 2:02 a.m. Elias picked it up using a latex glove. He thought back to the dispatch report. Claire, the veteran dispatcher, had sounded shaken. She had mentioned that the caller sounded like a young girl, someone small, terrified, and high-pitched. Elias looked at the man being led away. The victim was a large man, broad-shouldered and rugged despite his current state. "Sir," Elias called out, "when you called for help, why did you speak like that?" The man stopped on the stairs. He turned back, and the look in his eyes made Elias's blood run cold. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, broken shame. "He made me," he whispered. "For 2 years, every time he came down here, he told me I was his little girl. If I didn't speak in that voice, if I didn't play the part, he wouldn't feed me. He wouldn't give me water." The man's voice hitched, sliding up an octave into a haunting, childlike falsetto. "I forgot how to be a man, officer. I forgot my own voice." The victim was ushered out to a waiting ambulance, but the weight of the house remained. Elias stayed behind with Rex to wait for the forensics team. "He's safe, Rex. We got him," Elias said, reaching down to pat the dog's head. But Rex wasn't relaxed. He was standing at the base of the basement stairs, looking up into the kitchen. Suddenly, his ears flattened. He let out a sharp warning bark. Upstairs, in the kitchen, a floorboard creaked. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was heavy and deliberate. It was coming from exactly where the pantry door sat. "Miller? Higgins? Is that you?" Elias shouted. No response. Elias ran up the stairs, Rex hot on his heels. When he reached the kitchen, the basement door slammed shut behind him with such force that the frame groaned. Elias spun around, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like as someone or something was holding it shut from the other side with superhuman strength. From behind the door,
a voice drifted through the wood. It wasn't the broken voice of the victim. It was a deep, resonant, and mocking tone. "You should have stayed upstairs, Elias. Rex knows. Why don't you?" Elias stepped back, his heart hammering. He looked at the door, then at Rex. The dog was backing away, his eyes fixed on the empty space in the middle of the kitchen, where the shadows seemed to be thickening, despite the morning light beginning to bleed through the windows.
The kitchen was silent once more, but the air felt heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Elias stood with his back to the marble island, his weapon still aimed at the basement door that had slammed shut by itself. Rex was huddled near the back exit, his fur damp and his spirit clearly broken. "Dispatch, this is Thorne," Elias said, his voice tight. "I need an immediate ID on the property owner, and get a tactical team back in here. The physics of this house aren't lining up." Within the hour, the house was swarming with investigators and a forensics team. The heavy basement door was pried open, but the space behind it was empty. No one was holding the handle. No one was hiding in the shadows. The mocking voice Elias had heard seemed to have evaporated into the damp walls. Detective Sarah Vance, a woman who had seen 20 years of the city's worst crimes, walked over to Elias. She held a tablet displaying the property's history. "This place is a black hole, Elias," she said, her brow furrowed. "The current owner on record is a Thomas Thorne, no relation to you, I assume. But here's the kicker. Thomas Thorne died in 1994. The taxes have been paid in cash at the city clerk's office every year since. No bank accounts, no utility signatures, just a ghost paying the bills." Elias looked at the screen. "And the man we rescued? The father of 3? "David Miller," Sarah confirmed, "missing for 2 years. His family thought he was carjacked. He was kept down there in that cell, but he told us something even weirder. He said he never saw the face of his captor, just a tall, dark shape that moved without making a sound." Elias felt a pull to go back upstairs. Despite Rex's refusal to follow, Elias climbed the stairs once more, this time accompanied by Sarah. They bypassed the first 2 rooms and headed straight for the empty bedroom where the tall figure had vanished. Forensics had set up powerful work lights, bathing the room in a clinical white glow. It looked even more mundane now, which made Elias's memory of the shadow feel like a fever dream. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to the dresser Elias had checked earlier. She wasn't looking in the drawers, but behind them. She pulled the entire oak unit away from the wall. Behind it, the wallpaper was peeling, but not from age. It had been carefully sliced. Elias reached out and peeled back a section of the floral paper. Beneath it wasn't drywall, but an old lath and plaster wall with a narrow vertical slit, a peep slot that looked directly into the hallway. But that wasn't the discovery that stopped Elias's heart. Tucked into the wall was a small leather-bound ledger. Elias opened it carefully. The pages were filled with names, dates, and meticulously drawn maps of the subdivision. Each name had a corresponding voice type written next to it: child, soprano, whispered, broken. Beside David Miller's name, the entry read, "Final stage, voice achieved, transition pending." At the very back of the ledger was a photograph, yellowed and brittle. It showed a man standing in front of this very house. He was tall, impossibly thin, with long, spidery fingers. His eyes were hidden by thick-brimmed glasses, but his smile was the most disturbing part. It was too wide, stretching across a face that seemed too narrow for it. "That's the man I saw," Elias whispered. "But the photo, it looks like it was taken in the 70s. Suddenly, the work lights flickered. The hum of the generator outside died down for a split second. From the hallway, the sound of a dog's nails clicking on wood echoed. Click, click, click.
Elias turned, expecting to see Rex finally finding his courage, but the hallway was empty. Rex was still outside in his crate. The clicking sound continued, moving past the bedroom door toward the bathroom. Then a voice, high-pitched, sweet, and terrifyingly like a young girl's, drifted from the bathroom. "Is it safe to come out now, officer?" Elias and Sarah exchanged a look of pure dread. They knew the victim was already at the hospital. They knew the house was supposed to be clear. Elias stepped into the hall and shined his light toward the bathroom. Standing there was the figure again, but this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was wearing a pink Barbie doll dress, stretched and torn over its massive skeletal frame. It held a cracked porcelain doll in one hand and a long, jagged piece of glass in the other. "I haven't practiced my police voice yet," the thing whispered, its jaw unhinging in a way no humans could. "Would you like to help me?"
The figure in the doorway didn't move like a person. It didn't have the heavy, lumbering weight of the man Elias had imagined. When it shifted, its limbs clicked and popped like dry kindling. The pink dress it wore was a grotesque contrast to the gray, leathery skin of its neck and hands. "Sarah, get back!" Elias hissed, his gun leveled at the entity's chest. Detective Vance didn't need to be told twice. She had her weapon out, but her eyes were fixed on the thing's face, or where a face should have been. Behind the thick glasses there were no eyes, only deep, hollow pits that seemed to pull the light from their tactical flashlights. "Drop the weapon!" Elias shouted. "Get on the ground!" The thing tilted its head. The porcelain doll in its hand shattered as its grip tightened. Then, with a speed that defied its skeletal frame, it lunged. It didn't run down the hallway. It scrambled along the wall, its fingers digging into the plaster like claws. Elias fired. The crack-crack of his service weapon was deafening in the narrow space. Dust and plaster exploded where the figure had been a split second before. It disappeared into the second bedroom, the kids' room. "He's cornered!" Sarah yelled, charging toward the door. They burst into the room, their light sweeping the floor, the bed, the closet. It was empty. The toys remained untouched on the rug. The posters of cartoon heroes stared back with indifferent eyes. "There's no way," Elias panted. "I saw him come in here. There are no windows in this room, Sarah." Elias walked to the center of the room. He looked at the floorboards, then at the ceiling. Something was wrong with the dimensions. From the outside, this wing of the house should have been 10 feet wider. He kicked at the baseboard near the closet. It made a hollow, metallic clink. "Sarah, help me with this dresser," Elias commanded. They shoved the small white dresser aside. Behind it was a seam in the wood, so fine it was almost invisible to the naked eye. Elias jammed his tactical knife into the crack and pried. A section of the wall, 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, swung inward on silent, greased hinges. Behind the wall wasn't a room, but a skin. A secondary set of walls had been built inside the original frame of the house, creating a 6-inch gap, a crawl space that snaked through the entire structure. Elias clicked on his light and peered into the darkness of the gap. It was lined with sound-dampening foam and hung with hundreds of wires. At intervals, there were small brass tubes, old-fashioned speaking pipes, that ran to every room in the house. "Officer?" The voice came from the pipe nearest Elias's ear. It wasn't the girl's voice anymore. It was a perfect mimicry of his own. "Officer, is it safe to come out now?" The entity wasn't just hiding, it was the house itself. It lived in the interstitial spaces, watching through the peep slots and listening through the tubes. Suddenly, the floor beneath Elias vibrated. A heavy thud echoed from inside the wall to his left, then rapidly moved downward. "He's heading for the basement again," Sarah yelled. They scrambled back toward the stairs. As they passed the bathroom, Elias glanced in. The blood he had seen earlier, the pool on the carpet, was gone. In its place was a small pink ribbon, neatly folded into a bow.
They reached the kitchen just in time to hear a horrific sound from outside. A growl followed by a sharp, terrified yelp. "Rex!" Elias screamed. He threw open the back door. The rain was still a deluge, blurring the world into shades of gray. Rex's crate, which had been securely locked and placed under the porch, was overturned. The heavy steel door was bent outward as if hit by a sledgehammer. Rex was gone. A trail of deep, claw-like gouges led from the porch toward the overgrown bushes at the edge of the property, the same bushes that blocked the windows of the basement. "He's taking the dog," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Elias, he's taking the dog into the crawl space from the outside." From the darkness of the bushes, a pair of thick-brimmed glasses caught the flash of a street lamp. The tall figure stood there for a heartbeat, holding Rex, a 70-pound German shepherd, off the ground by the scruff of his neck with a single hand. Then it stepped backward into the earth, vanishing into a hidden exterior hatch that Elias had missed during his initial sweep.
The rain felt like needles against Elias's skin as he sprinted toward the bushes. The professional distance he had maintained for 9 years as a handler shattered the moment he saw Rex, his partner, his shadow, his best friend, carried away like a rag doll. "Rex!" Elias's roar was swallowed by the thunder. He reached the spot where the figure had vanished. Pushing aside the tangled, thorny branches of the overgrown forsythia, he found it, a heavy iron grate camouflaged with dirt and dead leaves. It wasn't a basement window. It was a ventilation shaft for a Cold War-era fallout shelter that had been illegally expanded. "Elias, wait for the team!" Sarah shouted from the porch, but he was already gone. Elias dropped through the hatch. He fell 8 feet, landing hard on a floor of cold, damp earth and rotted timber. He ignored the flare of pain in his ankle, swinging his tactical light around. The air down here was different. It didn't just smell like blood anymore. It smelled like ancient dust and wood smoke. He was in a tunnel, barely 4 feet wide, shored up with rusted metal beams. It ran directly beneath the house, but it extended further toward the empty lot next door. "Rex, speak to me, boy!" A faint, muffled whine echoed from deep within the tunnel. It was followed by a sound that made Elias's skin crawl, the sound of someone humming a lullaby. It was a sweet, melodic tune, completely out of place in the dark, muddy bowels of the earth. Elias moved forward, his back hunched against the low ceiling. Every few yards he saw the brass pipes again, the speaking tubes he had seen in the house's walls. They sprouted from the ceiling of the tunnel like the roots of a poisonous tree. "Good dog, brave dog," the voice came through the pipes. It was Elias's voice. It was a perfect, chilling replica of the tone he used when he gave Rex a treat after a long shift. "Sit, Rex. Stay. Good boy." "Shut up!" Elias screamed, firing a shot into the ceiling of the tunnel. The bullet sparked against a metal pipe, and the humming stopped. He reached a junction where the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. His light hit a cage, a heavy iron-barred enclosure. Inside, Rex was curled into a ball, his breathing shallow. He wasn't physically wounded, but he was catatonic, his eyes glazed over as if he were lost in a nightmare. Standing atop the cage was the figure. In the confined space, its height was even more terrifying. It had to fold its limbs like a spider to fit under the ceiling. The pink dress was gone, replaced by a tattered black funeral suit that looked a century old. The figure turned its head 180 degrees to look at Elias. Behind the thick glass lenses, Elias finally saw what was there. It wasn't just hollow pits. There were thousands of tiny vibrating filaments, like the internal workings of a grand piano. "Why do you want them?" Elias asked, his gun leveled at the thing's head. "The man in the basement, the dog, why the voices?"
The thing's chest expanded. When it spoke, it didn't use one voice. It used dozens, a cacophony of every person who had ever lived in that house. Screams, whispers, laughter, and prayers, all layered on top of each other. A house is just a box, but a voice is a soul made of air. I am building a choir, Elias, and your dog has such a loyal, steady heartbeat. It will be the percussion. The thing lunged, not at Elias, but at the cage's lock. Its fingers, long and sharp as scalpels, began to pick at the mechanism. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't aim for the head, he aimed for the brass pipes. He fired 3 rapid shots, severing the speaking tubes. The sudden hiss of escaping air and the clatter of falling metal distracted the entity for a split second. Elias tackled the creature. It felt like hitting a bag of dry bones and cold silk. It was surprisingly light, but its strength was immense. A spindly hand wrapped around Elias's throat, and he felt his breath being squeezed out. As his vision began to blur, Elias saw Rex's eyes snap back to life. The dog saw his handler in danger. The catatonia vanished, replaced by the primal fury of a canine protector. Rex threw himself against the bars, the cage rattling on its hinges. "Rex, break!" Elias wheezed. But Rex didn't need the command. He threw his weight against the rusted lock. With a crack of breaking iron, the door flew open. But the entity didn't flee. It let go of Elias's throat and stood tall, its back pressing against the ceiling. It began to scream, a sound that wasn't a voice at all, but a frequency so high it shattered the glass lenses of its own spectacles.
The tunnel was beginning to rain, not water, but heavy clods of earth and ancient rusted rivets. The entity remained in the center of the chamber, its head tilted back, its chest heaving as it drew in every scrap of air to fuel its horrific, multi-tonal shriek. Rex didn't hesitate. The moment the cage door gave way, he was a streak of black and tan fury. He didn't go for the throat. His training took over, and he lunged for the creature's primary limb, sinking his teeth into the leathery, stick-thin arm that had been reaching for Elias. The scream cut off into a wet, distorted gurgle. The creature looked down at the dog with what might have been surprise if it had a face capable of the emotion. It tried to shake Rex off, but the German shepherd was an anchor, his jaws locked in a terminal hold. "Out, Rex, out!" Elias grabbed the back of Rex's tactical harness. He knew the tunnel was seconds from a total collapse. The ceiling was sagging, the roots of the speaking pipes tearing away from the earth and hissing like dying snakes. Elias hauled Rex back, and for a second the dog resisted, his protective instinct warring with his training. Finally, Rex let go, and the two of them bolted back toward the ventilation shaft. Behind them, the chamber folded in on itself. The sound of the house's foundation settling was like a series of cannon shots. Dust billowed through the narrow corridor, thick and choking, turning Elias's flashlight beam into a blunt, useless instrument. "Keep moving, boy! Keep moving!" They scrambled through the mud, Elias's boots slipping on the slick floor. He could hear the creature behind them. It wasn't running, it was skittering through the gap between the ceiling and the collapsing earth, its many voices whispering a frantic, overlapping prayer for them to stay, stay, stay. They reached the vertical shaft. Elias shoved Rex upward toward the iron grate. "Up, Rex! Climb!" The dog scrambled, his claws catching on the rungs of the ladder. Above, the night sky was a violent purple, framed by the jagged edges of the forsythia bushes. Sarah Vance appeared at the lip of the hole, her hands reaching down. She grabbed Rex's harness and hauled the 70-pound dog out of the earth, just as a massive timber beam crashed down into the tunnel floor, inches from Elias's heels. Elias grabbed the ladder and threw himself upward. As he broke the surface of the yard, the ground beneath the bushes sank 3 feet, swallowing the iron grate and the tunnel beneath it in a roar of settling soil.
He lay on the wet grass, gasping for air, while Rex stood over him, licking the grime from his face. "Elias, you're bleeding!" Sarah shouted, kneeling beside him. "I'm fine," he wheezed, sitting up. "Where is it? Did we bury it?" They looked toward the house. The structure was tilted now, the back corner sinking into the void left by the tunnels. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the neighborhood was eerily silent. The police cruisers on the street were still there, their lights painting the wet trees in strobes of blue. Then Rex growled. He wasn't looking at the house, he was looking at the property line, the exact point where the overgrown lawn met the sidewalk of the quiet subdivision. Standing under the glow of a flickering street lamp was the figure. It looked smaller now, its black suit shredded, its long fingers dragging on the concrete. It was no longer a shadow, it was a broken thing, a collection of stolen parts held together by a fading will. It took a step onto the sidewalk, crossing the boundary of the property it had haunted for decades. The moment its foot touched the public concrete, the choir began to fail. The voices it had stolen, the children, the broken men, the whispers, began to leak out into the night air. They weren't screams, they were sighs of relief. The creature turned to look at Elias one last time. It didn't speak in Elias's voice. It spoke in a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "The box is broken, but the air remembers everything." And then it simply unraveled. The black suit fell to the ground in a heap of rot. The frame beneath it, the filaments and the bones, dissolved into a fine gray ash that the wind swept away before it even hit the pavement. Elias stood up, leaning heavily on Rex. The house was now a ruin, a lopsided shell of a home that would eventually be demolished by the city. "It's over," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. Elias looked at the pile of tattered clothes on the sidewalk. He looked at the house. He knew that somewhere, in another quiet subdivision, there was another box being built. "Not for him," Elias whispered, looking down at Rex. The dog was looking back at the house, his ears twitching. He didn't look scared anymore. He looked like he was listening to something very far away, a faint, lingering echo of a young girl's laugh that finally, truly, faded into the night.
2 weeks had passed since the night the earth swallowed the ventilation shaft. Elias sat in a windowless room at Internal Affairs, the fluorescent lights humming with an annoying high-pitched buzz that reminded him too much of the entity's frequency. Across from him sat Chief Inspector Sterling, a man whose face was a map of institutional rigidity. On the table between them was Elias's official report, the one detailing the tall figure, the speaking pipes, and the unraveling of a creature on a public sidewalk. "Officer Thorne," Sterling began, his voice dry, "we've reviewed your statement, and Detective Vance's, and the forensics report." "And?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively reaching down to where Rex usually sat. The dog was home, still recovering from the psychological trauma, refusing to enter any room with a closed door. "Detective Vance has revised her statement," Sterling said coldly. "She now attributes her observations to acute stress-induced hallucinations caused by the toxic mold and lack of oxygen in the tunnels. You would be wise to do the same if you want to keep your shield." Elias realized then that the police force wasn't just there to catch criminals. It was there to maintain the illusion of a world that made sense. Elias was placed on mandatory administrative leave. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the clicking of nails on floorboards. But he was a canine handler. He was trained to track. If the department wouldn't give him answers, he'd find them in the paper trail. He spent his days in the city archives, a subterranean maze of files that smelled of vinegar and old dust. He wasn't looking for Thomas Thorne anymore. He was looking for the house's architect. After 30 hours of searching, he found it, a set of blueprints from 1952 for the entire Crestwood Phase 1 development. They weren't signed by a firm, by a man named Silas Vane. Tucked into the blueprints was a second ledger, a thin black book that looked identical to the one he'd found behind the dresser. This ledger didn't contain names of victims. It contained a philosophy. The human voice is the only part of the soul that can be captured in wood and brass, the first page read. A house should not just shelter the body, it should resonate with the life within. If the resonance is perfect, the house becomes a living throat. As Elias flipped through the pages, he found a map of the city. There weren't just one or two houses marked with a red X. There were dozens. They were scattered across every subdivision, every quiet street, and every remote town in the state. One of the red marks was circled twice. It was an address only 3 blocks from where Elias lived with his young daughter. Elias rushed home, his heart hammering. He burst through his front door, calling out for his daughter. "Daddy, I'm in the kitchen." He ran into the kitchen, but the room was empty. "I'm in here, Daddy." The voice came from the laundry room. Elias stopped. He looked at the wall. Beside the refrigerator was a small circular vent, one he had always assumed was for the central heating. He leaned in close. "I'm in here, Daddy." The voice came from the vent, but the tone was wrong. It was too perfect. It was a loop, a recording made of air and wood. Rex, who had been hiding under the sofa, suddenly let out a low, mournful howl. He stood up and walked to the wall, his nose pressed against the vent. He didn't bark. He just whimpered, a sound of recognition. Elias grabbed a hammer from his tool belt and smashed the drywall. Behind the plaster wasn't insulation. It was a brass pipe. The architect hadn't just built a house in Crestwood. He'd spent 70 years building a network, and the choir wasn't missing its percussion. It was just waiting for a new conductor.
Blueprints. The brass pipe behind the drywall shimmered in the kitchen light like a golden artery. Elias reached in, his fingers grazing the cold metal. It didn't feel like a plumbing fixture. It felt like a nerve. When he touched it, a faint vibration hummed through his hand, a low-frequency thrum that matched the rhythm of a human heart. Elias didn't call the station. He knew Sterling would have him committed before the first cruiser arrived. Instead, he grabbed his go-bag, his off-duty piece, and a heavy-duty crowbar. "Rex, stay," he commanded, but the dog refused. Rex stood by the door, his teeth bared at the wall. The fear that had paralyzed him in the Crestwood house had been replaced by a grim ancestral hatred. He knew this enemy. Elias loaded Rex into the truck and drove toward the city archives one last time. He didn't check in. He used his master key to enter the restricted records vault after hours. He needed to know why his house was marked. He needed to know who Silas Vane really was. He pulled the birth and death records for Silas Vane. The man had supposedly died in 1978, but the death certificate was a forgery. The signature of the attending physician matched a name Elias had seen in the first ledger, a victim. Elias began to trace the Vane bloodline. It was a tangled web of aliases and sudden disappearances, but as he reached the late 1980s, a name jumped off the page, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Elena Vane. Elena was his mother's maiden name. His hands shook as he pulled his own birth certificate from his digital files.
He had always been told his father was a wandering laborer who had died before he was born, but there, in the shadowed history of the archives, he found the truth. Silas Vane wasn't just an architect, he was Elias's grandfather. The unexplainable night calls, the instinct that had led him to become a canine handler, the way he could sense the shadows, it wasn't just training, it was a biological resonance. He was a part of the choir. Suddenly, the lights in the archive vault flickered and died. The hum of the building's HVAC system changed, sliding into that familiar, terrifying melody. Elias. The voice came from the air vents above the filing cabinets. It was his mother's voice, soft, sweet, and exactly as he remembered it from his childhood. "Elias, why are you digging in the dirt? You were always such a curious boy." "Where are you?" Elias shouted, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "I'm in the walls, Elias. I'm in the floors. We all are. Silas didn't just build houses, he built a way for us to never truly leave." Rex began to bark, a frantic, echoing sound in the vault. He was circling a large, antique wooden desk in the corner. Elias kicked the desk aside, revealing a heavy trapdoor leading to the building's utility tunnels. Elias dropped into the darkness, Rex following without hesitation. These weren't dirt tunnels. These were finished, polished corridors, lined with thousands of brass pipes, all converging toward a central hub beneath the city's main square. This was the main exchange. As he moved deeper, the whispers became a roar. Hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, created a sonic pressure that made Elias's ears bleed. He reached a massive chamber where the pipes fed into a singular, giant organ-like structure made of bone, wood, and steel. And sitting at the console was the figure, the tall man. But he wasn't wearing a dress or a suit anymore. He was draped in the skins of the ledgers, his body a patchwork of names and voices. The entity turned. Its face was a shifting mosaic of features. For a split second, it looked exactly like Elias. "Grandson," the voices harmonized, "the city is out of tune. We need your voice to steady the percussion." Elias raised his weapon, but his finger felt like lead. The pipes were humming his name, a lullaby designed to put his very soul to sleep. "I'm not your percussion," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm the one who breaks the box."
The air in the main exchange was thick enough to choke on. The massive organ of bone and brass, the great resonance, pulsed with a bioluminescent glow. Each pipe represented a stolen life, a captured frequency, a soul held in a state of perpetual vibration. "You feel it, don't you?" The architect entity harmonized, the patchwork of faces on its head shifting like water. "The blood in your veins is tuned to this frequency. You aren't just an officer, Elias. You are the tuning fork." Elias's vision blurred. The humming from the pipes began to synchronize with his heartbeat. He felt a terrifying sense of peace wash over him, a beckoning to let go, to merge with the choir and live forever in the walls of the city he had sworn to protect. His gun felt heavy, useless. How do you shoot a sound? How do you arrest a legacy? "Everything you love is in the walls now," the voices whispered. "Your mother, your grandfather, your daughter's future. Why fight the inevitable?" But there was one frequency the great resonance couldn't account for, the raw, unedited soul of a beast. Rex lunged. He didn't attack the entity, he attacked the foundation. He began to tear at the ancient leather-wrapped bellows that pumped the breath through the bone pipes. The creature let out a distorted shriek, not a girl's voice or a man's, but a sound of pure mechanical failure.
"Rex, no!" the entity screamed, its long fingers reaching for the dog. The sound of Rex's snarling broke the spell. It was a jagged, ugly, beautiful noise that didn't belong in Silas Vane's perfect symphony. It was the sound of life, messy, loud, and mortal. Elias snapped back to reality. He didn't aim at the entity's heart. He aimed at the conductor's pipe, the massive central flue made of human vertebrae that directed the voices of the entire city. "This is for the man in the basement and for every voice you stole." He emptied his magazine into the central flue. The bone shattered. The pressurized air erupted with the force of a bomb. The great resonance began to tear itself apart. The vibration reversed, turning from a harmonic hum into a destructive tremor. The brass pipes buckled and twisted, the stolen voices escaping in a final deafening blast of white noise. The tall man, the patchwork of Silas Vane, began to vibrate so violently that his features blurred into a gray mist. As the ceiling of the exchange started to collapse, the entity reached out one last time, its hand trembling. "Elias, without the choir, the city is just silence." "Good," Elias said, grabbing Rex by the harness. "Silence is where we start over." The main square of the city didn't collapse, but every window within 3 blocks shattered simultaneously at 4:12 a.m. The official report would blame a massive underground gas explosion triggered by aging infrastructure. Elias stood on the sidewalk, his uniform shredded, his face covered in the gray ash of a dead legacy. Rex sat beside him, his head resting on Elias's knee. The dog's ears were no longer twitching. The hum was gone. Elias looked at his hands. They were steady. He knew the department would bury the truth. He knew the ledgers were destroyed. But he also knew that he would never truly be at peace in a house again. Months later, Elias resigned from the force. He moved to a cabin in the mountains, a place of stone and wood, built by hand, with no pipes, no vents, and no hidden spaces. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Rex, the wind began to whistle through the trees. For a split second, the sound mimicked a human sigh. Rex perked his ears, listening. Elias didn't reach for a gun. He didn't panic. He simply whistled a tune of his own, a simple, wandering melody that didn't follow any architect's plan. The wind moved on, the silence returned, and for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne was just a man, sitting with his dog, listening to the quiet of a world that was finally, truly his own.